The Shroud of Turin is this amazing relic. At bottom, it's a piece of cloth. It shows a very faint sort of image of a crucified man. And the crucified man calls us to remember Jesus' death and resurrection.
He walked in expecting a fraud, and walked out questioning everything he thought he knew about history, science, and faith. Barrie Schwortz, a Jewish photographer, arrived at a cathedral in Turin, certain he would expose a medieval painting.
I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Shroud of Turin Research Project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin.
5 days later, surrounded by the world's leading scientists, he found something that no modern technology could explain. No paint, no pigments, no brush strokes, just an image burned into cloth, defying every law of physics. How could this image exist without a known method of creation? What secrets had been hidden in this relic for centuries? What he uncovered would haunt him for decades, and it may change the way you see one of the most studied relics in human history. This is the story of the Shroud of Turin.
The Shroud of Turin, a mysterious religious relic. Many believe it shows the true face of Christ.
There are many faithful who would look at it and know somehow in their hearts that it is something of Christ.
The reluctant investigator. Barrie Schwortz was not looking for God when the invitation arrived. He was a highly skilled technical and medical photographer, respected in his field, comfortable in his secular Jewish identity, and completely uninterested in religious artifacts. When the Shroud of Turin Research Project asked him to join their team in 1978, his first instinct was to refuse. He couldn't see how his expertise connected to an old piece of cloth that most people assumed was a medieval forgery. The whole thing felt like a waste of time. But something about the offer kept nagging at him. A free trip to Italy wasn't nothing, and there was a certain curiosity buried beneath his skepticism that wanted to see what all the fuss was about. So he said yes, expecting to confirm what he already believed, that the shroud was an elaborate fake that would crumble under scientific scrutiny. He would later describe his attitude during those early days as childish. He joked publicly about how quickly he expected to debunk the thing. He figured he would spot the brush marks within minutes, declare victory, and move on with his life. What he didn't anticipate was the caliber of scientists who would be working alongside him. This wasn't a group of religious zealots looking to validate their faith. The team included physicists, chemists, imaging specialists, and forensic experts from institutions like NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and major research universities. These were people who had worked on the Voyager and Galileo space missions. They approached the Shroud with the same rigor they would apply to analyzing data from distant planets, and they were just as skeptical as Barrie. One scientist in particular would change the trajectory of Barrie's involvement. Don Lin was a respected imaging expert from NASA who had spent his career analyzing photographs from spacecraft exploring the outer solar system.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather, in my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields.
When Lin joined the team, Barrie found himself genuinely impressed. Here was a man whose credentials were beyond question, someone who had contributed to humanity's understanding of Jupiter and Saturn, and he was taking this investigation seriously. During a planning meeting, Barrie finally voiced the question that had been bothering him since he accepted the invitation. He asked Lin directly, why was he, a Jewish man with no religious stake in the outcome, even part of this project? Lin's response hit him like a thunderbolt. Maybe God wanted one of his chosen people on the team, Lin said with quiet confidence. Then he added something Barrie would carry with him for the rest of his life. Go to Turin. Do your very best work. Trust that the bigger purpose will reveal itself in time. Those words kept Barrie from walking away, and they would echo in his mind across decades of investigation that led him somewhere he never expected to go. 5 days that defied science. The examination began in October 1978, and it was unlike anything the scientific world had seen before. For 5 days and nights, working around the clock with minimal sleep, the team subjected the shroud to every test they could devise. They photographed it in visible light, ultraviolet light, and infrared light. They used fluorescence imaging to detect organic compounds. They took fiber samples for microscopic analysis. They measured reflectance spectra to identify chemical compositions. They employed the same technologies used to analyze extraterrestrial materials and decode signals from deep space. Nothing was assumed. Everything was questioned. The shroud would either survive this examination or be exposed as a clever fabrication created by medieval artists who had fooled believers for centuries. Barrie's role was to document everything. As a technical photographer, he captured every detail of the cloth under every imaginable condition. And as he worked, hour after hour, something strange began happening. The evidence wasn't cooperating with his expectations. The shroud refused to reveal the secrets of its creation. There were no brush strokes anywhere on the cloth, no accumulated layers of pigment that would indicate painting. When they analyzed the fibers under magnification, they found no evidence of any applied coloring agent. The image existed only on the very topmost fibers of the cloth, penetrating to a depth of mere microns. It wasn't painted on. It wasn't dyed. It wasn't burned. It wasn't photographically developed. It simply existed, without any detectable mechanism to explain how it got there. The team systematically eliminated every hypothesis they could generate. Painting was ruled out because there were no pigments and no directionality in the application. Scorching was ruled out because the thermal characteristics were wrong and there was no fluorescence under ultraviolet light. Photography was ruled out because the technology didn't exist in the medieval period and the image characteristics didn't match photographic processes anyway. Contact transfer was ruled out because the image showed no distortion from wrapping around a three-dimensional form. Vaporography, the idea that gases from a decomposing body created the image, was ruled out because the chemistry didn't work and the image resolution was too fine. Every time they thought they had an explanation, the evidence contradicted it. The shroud kept surviving tests designed to destroy its credibility. When the team finally published their results in peer-reviewed scientific journals, the conclusions were extraordinary. The image on the shroud could not be explained by any known natural or artificial process. It was not a painting, not a photograph, not a scorch, not a rubbing, not a contact print. The mechanism of image formation remained unknown. These findings were scrutinized by the scientific community, challenged by skeptics, and subjected to rigorous review. They held up.
The Shroud of Turin, which purports to show the body of Jesus Christ, is being put back on display for a limited time. The linen cloth first appeared in Europe in the 14th century and has been stored at the Turin Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Italy since the 1800s.
For Barrie, who had arrived expecting to expose a fraud, the experience was profoundly disorienting. He had witnessed something that defied explanation. He had participated in an investigation that should have provided answers, and instead only deepened the mystery. And he couldn't stop thinking about what it all meant. The blood that wouldn't darken. Despite the compelling evidence from the 1978 examination, Barrie Schwortz remained a skeptic for nearly 2 more decades. The scientific findings were impressive, certainly. The image formation mystery was genuinely puzzling. But there was one detail that he couldn't reconcile with authenticity. One piece of evidence that kept him from accepting what the data seemed to suggest. The blood on the shroud was still red. Anyone with basic knowledge of forensics knows that blood darkens within hours of leaving the body. Hemoglobin oxidizes. The color shifts from bright red to brown to black. Blood that is 2,000 years old should be virtually invisible, reduced to faint discoloration at best. Yet the blood stains on the shroud remain distinctly, vividly red. For Barrie, this was the fatal flaw. If the blood was somehow fake or enhanced, then the whole thing was suspect. If it was genuinely ancient, then it should have darkened. Either way, something didn't add up. The resolution came in 1995, 18 years after Barrie first examined the shroud, through a phone conversation that would shatter his remaining doubts. Dr. Alan Adler was a world-renowned blood chemist, a fellow Jewish scientist with no religious agenda, and one of the leading experts on porphyrins, the compounds that give blood its color. Adler had analyzed samples from the shroud and discovered something remarkable. The blood contained extraordinarily high levels of bilirubin, a compound produced when the body breaks down red blood cells under extreme physical stress. Barrie asked what could cause such elevated bilirubin levels. Adler's answer was chilling: severe trauma. The kind of trauma inflicted by beating, scourging, and crucifixion. When a human body is tortured to that degree, the shock causes massive hemolysis, the destruction of red blood cells. Bilirubin floods the system at levels far beyond anything seen under normal circumstances. Then Adler explained the critical detail that changed everything Barrie thought he knew. Blood with extremely high bilirubin content doesn't follow the normal oxidation pathway. The bilirubin binds to the hemoglobin in a way that prevents the typical darkening process. Blood from a torture victim, someone who had been beaten and crucified, would remain red indefinitely. It would never darken. The very detail that Barrie had considered proof of fraud turned out to be evidence of authenticity. The blood was red precisely because it came from someone who had suffered exactly the kind of death described in the Gospels. In that moment, Barrie felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. A quote from Sherlock Holmes surfaced in his memory, something he had read as a child. "Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." Combined with Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually correct, Barrie arrived at a conclusion he had resisted for almost 2 decades. The shroud was authentic. It was the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. The anatomy of a mystery. Understanding why the shroud has captivated scientists for decades requires understanding exactly what they're looking at. The cloth itself is a piece of ancient linen approximately 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide, woven in a distinctive herringbone twill pattern that shows characteristics consistent with high-quality textile production from the 1st century Middle East. The weave is complex, requiring a sophisticated loom and considerable skill to produce, the kind of craftsmanship that would have been expensive and reserved for individuals of some importance. Faint but unmistakable on its surface is the image of a man, front and back, as if the cloth had been draped over a body lying on one half and then folded over the top to cover the front. The figure is life-sized, depicting an adult male approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, with long hair, a beard, and a physique consistent with someone in their early 30s. But it's not the general appearance that astounds researchers. It's the details. The figure shows wounds consistent with Roman crucifixion, executed with forensic precision.
The way Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on April 3rd, AD 33. We know the exact date. It's the best established fact of the ancient world.
That medieval artists could not have known. Marks from scourging cover the back and legs, over 100 individual wounds distributed in patterns that match the trajectory of a Roman flagrum. A whip with multiple leather thongs tipped with lead weights, or sharp bone fragments designed to shred flesh with each strike. The wounds fan outward from 2 points of origin, exactly as they would if 2 executioners stood on either side of a victim and delivered alternating blows. Puncture wounds circle the scalp, not in a neat ring like artistic depictions of a crown of thorns, but scattered across the entire top of the head as if from a cap of thorns pressed down and hammered into place. A large wound appears in the side, between the 5th and 6th ribs, precisely where a Roman spear thrust upward would penetrate the heart. And the nail wounds appear not in the palms, where every medieval artist placed them, but through the wrists. This anatomical accuracy is extraordinary and deeply troubling for anyone who wants to dismiss the shroud as a medieval forgery. Artists of that era universally depicted crucifixion with nails through the palms, because that was the established iconographic tradition. They didn't know, couldn't have known, that nails through the palms cannot support body weight. The tissue tears, the hand rips free. Roman executioners understood this, which is why they drove nails through the wrist, between the radius and ulna, where the bones could bear the load. This knowledge was lost for centuries until modern forensic science and archaeological discoveries confirmed it. The shroud shows exactly what Roman crucifixion actually looked like, not what medieval people believed it looked like. Even more telling, the image shows the thumbs folded inward against the palms. When a nail damages the median nerve in the wrist, the thumb reflexively contracts. No medieval artist knew this. No one knew this until modern medicine mapped the nervous system centuries later. The blood flow patterns present another layer of impossible accuracy. The stains show blood that flowed while the body was vertical, streaming down the arms at angles consistent with someone hanging from outstretched hands, and blood that pooled horizontally after the body was laid flat. The forensic consistency is perfect. The wound in the side shows separation of blood and serum, a phenomenon called post-mortem blood separation that only occurs after death, when blood begins to settle and separate into components. Whoever or whatever created this image understood the difference between antemortem and post-mortem bleeding, understood the mechanics of crucifixion, understood anatomy at a level that wouldn't exist for another 500 years. But the most baffling aspect of the shroud isn't the anatomical accuracy. It's the image itself and how it exists on the cloth. The coloration affects only the topmost fibers, penetrating to a depth of approximately 200 nanometers, thinner than a single bacterium, thinner than a wavelength of visible light. Below this impossibly thin surface layer, the fibers are completely unaffected. There is no penetration, no saturation, no gradient fading from dark to light. The image is essentially two-dimensional, existing only on the outermost surface of the threads. No painting technique produces this effect. No dye behaves this way. No known physical or chemical process results in coloration limited to such an infinitesimally thin layer. And when researchers in 1976 processed photographs of the shroud through a VP8 image analyzer, a device that converts brightness into topographic height data, the image produced a perfect three-dimensional relief of a human body. Normal photographs produce distorted garbage when processed this way because brightness correlates with lighting, not distance. But the shroud image encoded actual three-dimensional spatial information, as if whatever created it varied in intensity based on proximity to the body surface.
The Shroud of Turin, a mysterious religious relic. Many believe it shows the true face of Christ.
There are many faithful who would look at it and know, somehow in their hearts, that it is something of Christ.
What process could do that? What energy source decreases predictably with distance and leaves its mark only on the outermost nanometers of cloth fibers? After decades of investigation, no one has answered that question. The physics of the shroud remain completely unknown. The guardian of truth. After his conversion from skeptic to believer, Barrie Schwortz faced a new challenge. The public understanding of the shroud was being shaped not by scientific evidence, but by sensational media coverage that consistently got the facts wrong. In 1996, he received a phone call from a friend that crystallized the problem perfectly. The friend casually mentioned that the shroud had been debunked. When Barrie asked what he meant, the friend explained that he had read in a tabloid at the grocery store that the shroud was actually a photograph created by Leonardo da Vinci. Barrie initially thought it was a joke. It wasn't. His friend genuinely believed this absurd claim because he had encountered it in print and had no access to contradictory information. The theory was nonsense on multiple levels. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452, but the shroud has documented history dating back to at least the 1350s. More importantly, the image on the shroud bears no resemblance to photographic processes and shows none of the characteristics that photography would produce. But none of that mattered if the public had no way to access accurate information. That phone call became the catalyst for Barrie's next mission. He created Shroud.com, which would grow into the largest and most comprehensive repository of shroud research anywhere in the world. The site launched before Google became a household name, before the internet became the primary source of information for most people. Barrie assembled every scientific paper, every photograph, every analysis, every piece of credible research he could find. He created a resource that allowed anyone, skeptic or believer, to examine the evidence directly rather than relying on second-hand reports and tabloid speculation. The site grew far beyond his initial expectations. Millions of visitors would eventually access it, making it the definitive source for serious shroud research. For 14 years, Barrie funded and maintained the website entirely out of his own pocket. In 2009, recognizing that the project had grown too large for one person to sustain, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving the research and making it accessible to future generations. The mission was never about promoting a particular religious viewpoint. It was about ensuring that the massive amount of data collected over decades of scientific investigation wouldn't be lost or forgotten. Future researchers shouldn't have to start from scratch. They should be able to build on everything that had already been discovered. Barrie maintained strict rules about the site's integrity. No advertising, no sensationalism, no agenda beyond the pursuit of truth. People often asked Barrie why a Jewish man would dedicate his life to preserving research about what many considered the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. The question contained an assumption he rejected. He wasn't advocating for Christianity. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He was a scientist, or at least a scientific advocate, who believed that evidence should be preserved and made available regardless of its implications. If the shroud was authentic, that was a matter of historical and scientific importance that transcended religious boundaries. If it was a forgery, then understanding how it was created would be equally valuable. Either way, the research mattered. The truth mattered. And Barrie had come to believe, after decades of investigation, that he had a responsibility to protect that truth from being buried under misinformation and sensationalism. Beyond skepticism. Something unexpected happened after Barrie launched his website and began publicly sharing his conclusions about the shroud's authenticity. People started asking him a question he hadn't anticipated. They weren't asking about the science. They weren't asking about the image formation mechanism, or the blood chemistry, or the three-dimensional encoding. They were asking about him. What do you believe? The question caught him off guard. For his entire adult life, Barrie had avoided thinking seriously about faith. He had been raised in a close-knit Orthodox Jewish family where traditions were strictly observed, and religion was woven into daily life. But somewhere along the way, he had rejected all of it. He had built his identity around secular pursuits, professional achievements, intellectual skepticism. God wasn't part of the equation. And now, at age 50, strangers were asking him to articulate beliefs he had never bothered to examine. The shroud had forced Barrie to confront evidence that defied naturalistic explanation. An image that couldn't be explained by any known process. Blood with chemical properties consistent with crucifixion trauma. three-dimensional information encoded in a two-dimensional surface, anatomical accuracy that exceeded medieval medical knowledge. The data pointed towards something extraordinary, something that pushed against the boundaries of what science considered possible. But what did that mean for him personally? What did it mean for how he understood the universe, his own existence, his relationship to the tradition he had abandoned decades earlier? The process of confronting these questions was slow and painful. Barrie had spent 50 years building walls against exactly this kind of introspection. But the evidence wouldn't let him rest. The mystery of the shroud had cracked something open inside him, a door he thought he had permanently sealed. And when he finally allowed himself to look through that door, he discovered something that shocked him. God had been there the entire time. The divine presence he had denied and ignored and fled from hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply waited, patiently, for him to stop running and turn around. Barrie's faith journey didn't lead him to convert to Christianity. He remained Jewish, but he emerged from the experience transformed, no longer the detached skeptic who had first examined the shroud expecting to expose a fraud. He had been changed by what he witnessed, not just intellectually but spiritually. The respect Barrie received from people of all backgrounds often surprised him. Christians thanked him for his work. Muslims expressed appreciation for his integrity. Fellow Jews engaged thoughtfully with his research. Even atheists and skeptics, with whom he debated on countless radio and television programs, treated him with a kind of grudging respect. They seemed to recognize that he wasn't pushing an agenda. He was simply trying to be honest about what the evidence showed. The irony of his position wasn't lost on him. A Jewish man standing in Vatican institutions, lecturing future priests about the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It wasn't a path he would have chosen. It wasn't a path he could have imagined. But looking back on decades of investigation, he couldn't deny that some force beyond his understanding had placed him exactly where he needed to be. For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has resisted every attempt to explain it. Every fiber, every shadow, every detail defies the limits of human knowledge. Barrie Schwortz dedicated his life to uncovering its secrets. And still, the cloth refuses to yield its truth. What force, what event, could have left such a mark? And if science cannot explain it, what does that mean for everything we think we know about history, faith, and the nature of reality? The story is far from over, and the mystery still waits in the silence of the linen.